All right, everybody, welcome to my review of episode 4 of Alone Frozen. They called this one Bone Cold, but I am dubbing this episode the Crying Over Our Food episode. You see each of us get game of some kind, and you see both Callie and I getting our first game and being so thrilled, so overjoyed at the taste of it that we both cry and talk about the fact that it's so good we're crying. I'm going to be talking about a lot of things in this episode. Specifically, I'm going to be going into some survival topics like talking about bird biology and the difference between a crop and a gizzard and why one is edible and delicious and one not so much. I'm going to be talking about the difference between hares and rabbits, letting you know that there is one, and it is hares you're seeing on this show, even though I am always referring to them as rabbits. I use them interchangeably, but I'm a biologist and I actually know the difference, so let's talk about it. I'm also going to be talking about a subject specific to women, and that is getting our moon time out there. I get a lot of questions wondering what that's like, how we deal with it out there. So I'm going to be addressing that because it came up in this episode. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about what Amos talked about in terms of the weight of both his bow and his arrows and how that relates to large game such as bear. I would love for you to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the notifications bell if you want to know when my videos come out. Also, please consider supporting me on Patreon. It is my main source of funding to be able to maintain this YouTube channel and a lot of the other things I do. There's all kinds of awesome benefits for you that come with it, including a lot more personal interaction with me than I'm able to do with the general public. All right, folks, let's dive into episode 4. I was so psyched that they started the episode with me in the world's largest sweater. Not only was it the opener, but it was also the thumbnail for this episode. I put so much work into this sweater. It is double knit. It is super, super long. All of its proportions are enormous. And because it's ribbed, which is kind of an accordion style knitting, it was way bigger than it even looks in the clip of it. So this was a huge knitting project that I poured a ton of time into, and it was a major, major strategy of mine. And it is why I was able to go out there without parachute cord, because I knew that I had a ridiculous number of yards of cordage right out there with me without having to use one of my items for it. It also gave me the opportunity to say something that feels very true to me that I totally said on season 6 and never made the cut, but made it this time, which is that knitting is a survival skill. A lot of times the arts that are seen as more identified with women and femininity, such as knitting and sewing and that kind of thing, it's not actually true. There are lots of places around the world where knitting is seen as a male-dominated activity. So it depends on your culture. But often, traditional skills like that are seen as lesser than, not as important. And so being able to show the world that fiber arts and knitting, weaving, all of these things are really critical survival skills. It meant me being able to take an axe or my pemmican or what have you, because I did not have to waste one of my only 10 items on cordage. I had so much cordage out there from just that one sweater. I was able to use it to help put my shelter together. You saw me using it to mark my traps out there. That was not coincidence. I knit bright red into that sweater specifically to have as good markers for my snares out there. This episode shows me starting my trap line. My area was so sparse, and you can see this in the backdrop when I am processing that hare. There are so few trees around there that I really didn't know that there was going to be any game around at all. I had to hike a ways to get into thick enough forest where it seemed like there could be game, and I wasn't seeing any sign until that one amazing day that I saw my first sign of rabbit and decided, yes, it is worth starting my trap line. You also hear me talking about how I'm getting less and less mussels all the time. The issue was that the mussels were on the rocks that were deeper out, that were not exposed even at the lowest tides. That meant that my harvest was limited to those times when there was an unusually low tide, or mostly it was the mussels that had broken off the rocks and come onto the beach, or the shallow rocks that were exposed at the less low tides, but there just weren't that many of them. And you can see in one of the overhead scanning photos of my site that there's a shoal of rocks out there, the same ones I said in our last review were what meant I couldn't fish from the beach. But that is where the mussels really were. But I would have had to be wading into my hips to get to those, even on a lot of the lower tides. We then see Callie talking about having her moon time out there, and that it is a challenging time for her, even in the best of circumstances. She's often nauseous. It's not uncommon for people to be really tired and lethargic, in pain, which of course makes everything harder. So yes, having your moon time out there is definitely a big challenge. It is a real handicap for women on the show. In her circumstances, being nauseous and feeling like she shouldn't eat food that she might actually have, like maybe she still has some of that seal fat, that's definitely an issue out there, because you need to be concentrating on getting as many calories into your body as you can. So being nauseous on top of being cold and wet and hungry and everything being really, really hard, it's a big deal. Even though it's a bummer to be nauseous out there and not eating, it was a good choice for Callie to not push her body to eat when she was already feeling nauseous, because being nauseous is a bummer, but it is way easier on your body than actually vomiting. You're losing water, you're losing nutrients, you're doing damage. It's exhausting for your body to vomit. So good call for her to choose not to eat. So a lot of people wonder about the logistics of it. The show does provide menstrual supplies, pads for the ladies out there. So yes, we get some supplies, but it's still, of course, way harder to deal with given being out there, without running water, without the ability to bathe, without the ability to tend to ourselves in the ways that would be ideal for that time. It's also potentially an issue with animals out there, right? With polar bears and potentially black bears that are filling the ecological niche of grizzly bears, which they showed in one of the beginning episodes, not the bear itself, but one of the subtitles. So tending to it well is definitely an issue. And my solution was to burn my pads after using them so that there wasn't going to be, an animal smell on the mix of what was already probably an appealing smell to a potential predatory bear. Love that they show Callie building that grouse trap. I had a grouse trap like that too. I'm guessing they're not going to be showing that because frankly, Callie's was a lot more beautiful. Mine was not as pretty. So anyway, really great system. If there are a lot of grouse out there, that funnel really just has to be small enough that they can't open their wings to flap out. It's a principle that's used in some other traps. I've seen goose and duck traps where you kind of bring them down into a little trough in the ground, and then once they're in there, they can't open their wings to get out of it. So it's a common principle, and really curious to see if that trap's going to work for her. We then see Amos going out hunting and talking about what it feels like to be out there with a bow that he made himself. And absolutely, there's no feeling of connection like being out with what we would consider more primitive weapons, but weapons that are actually very, very sophisticated, but they're able to be made with low technology and also the kinds of human technology that we have been using for so long. So he's not just more connected to himself, more connected to nature, he's also more connected to the long line of human ancestry that we're using such skills to survive in the world. So I feel like the land really sees and recognizes when we come from a place of deep connection and heart. So Amos is talking about the weight of his bow and his arrows. Now, I want to be clear that these are two different kinds of weight. So when he's talking about the weight of his bow, what he means is the pounds of force required to pull his bow. So the tension that is required to get those limbs to bend backwards. When he's talking about the weight of his arrows, he's talking about the literal weight of them, how heavy they are if you were to place them on a scale. A bow can weigh less with more poundage required to pull it, or more depending on the style of the bow, the way it's made. There's a million different variations. So in order to hunt large game, you need a minimum of 44 to 45 pounds draw weight, because that's the amount of force that it's going to take to actually let that arrive at an animal with enough inertia to pass through it. So that's really, really important. For small game, you don't need that big a bow, or you don't need that heavy a draw weight of a bow. In fact, you tend to be less accurate with a heavier draw weight. But for big game, it's really important. So this is a case where you have to bring the bow that's capable of all of the jobs that you're wanting it to do, which means it's going to be a little less good at small game, but that's just the compromise you have to make. When we talk about arrows, this needs to be somewhat matched to your bow, but this is a different kind of thing. And this is very, very important specifically for big game, and big game that has significant ribs, really thick skin, a lot of fat to penetrate. The weight of your arrow has to do not with just how quickly it gets to that game animal, but if you have a lighter weight arrow, then it is going to have a harder time getting through that thick hide or that thick layer of fat in the case of bear, or if it hits a rib, not just stopping there, but actually being able to get through that rib, potentially breaking that rib and get through to the vitals, the lungs and the heart. So you definitely need to have an arrow that is heavier for big game, because the weight of that arrow gives it that momentum, that drive through to not be stopped when it gets to the skin or the first rib or what have you. So this is another thing that's tricky, because for small game, you don't want really heavy arrows. It's a tiny creature. You don't need that much force. But you can't have lightweight arrows for small game and heavier arrows for large game and have it not affect your aim. So what you need to do is add weights to your small game arrows so that they are the same weight as the heavier arrows that you're going to be using for your large game, so that when you aim with that bow, you know that whatever arrows you're using, large game or small, they're going to fly the same. You're going to have the same accuracy in aiming with both of those arrows. So in my case, I brought weights that I screwed on to the shafts of my small game arrows so that they would match the heavier weight of my large iron broadheads that I brought in order to take a bear. So there's a lot of bear talk happening here for sure. Pretty curious. Very cool that Michelle got a gift from the beach this episode. Thus far, everyone but Amos has been given an amazing gift on their beach, right? I started out with a water bottle, which was huge. No calories. Callie got a lot of calories, but a water bottle for me was really, really, really huge. To be able to carry water around me and know that I wasn't going to be under constant threat of dehydration was amazing. So we see Michelle get that. I call them gray jay. It calls them Canada jays here. Also in season 9, Tom got one and he was referring to it as whiskey jack. So that's another common name. So those are 3 different names for the same bird. Here's where I want to give a tip for wilderness cookery, because Michelle cooks up that jay and she's like, oh, this is so delicious, but it's very tough. She boiled it, it looks like. I developed a technique on season 6 for cooking game that I call a wilderness braise or a steam saute. Just boiling meat, it gets really tough and it tends to take a really long time to boil it enough to get soft and tender. And you don't digest all of it if it's really tough. Often those tendons and those gristly parts are just going to pass through you without being more broken down. So a long boil or a different technique that makes all of those gooey and just melting off the bone makes it not only way more delicious, but you get more out of it. So braising is a technique that's somewhere in between boiling and steaming, where you brown the meat and then you cook it partially covered in liquid, so the parts out of the liquid get steamed, and the steam actually breaks it down faster than boiling. Steaming is actually hotter than boiling water. So what I would do, because I didn't have fat to cook things in, is separate the limbs like you see me doing with the hares, and then cook those in the pan until they are just about to burn, and then add just a few drops of water to unstick the burnt parts. And that's a way that you can actually brown meat without burning it without fat. Browning first, you get the flavor of the roast game, but you get to cook it in the pot and have all of the good stuff stay in there. So browning it using the steam saute technique, and then throwing in, say, half the pot of water and doing that 3 times and turning it a few times so all of it is under the water sometimes and out of the water sometimes. Wilderness braise. It is amazing, and it makes the game so tender and delicious and dripping off the bone. I did that with the hare you see here. I did that with all of my game on season 6. Can't recommend it highly enough. We hear Callie being real serious, reflecting on her time on season 6 and the damage that it did to her body, and saying, just like most of us are saying out there, look, I know now what this experience does to me, does to my body, and I'm not going to put mine through that again. And As opposed to everybody else, I feel like I can really see the weight loss in Callie's face already. I think she has a really high metabolism. And I think that with her high metabolism, that's really making a difference. And we're hearing her talk about it, and we're seeing her really think things over. And I love that she expresses a deep dedication to self-love and caring for her body this time. She has permanent damage from season 7. I had permanent damage from season 6. We'll talk about that later. So I get it, and so glad to hear you committed to self-love, Callie, and demonstrating that to the world rather than this mentality we tend to see with Alone, which is throwing our bodies under the bus, pushing it to the limit so we get pulled, and that being a measure of success. Self-love, tending to your body, putting it first, heck yes, that's a very important measure of success. The next scene with me is me doing my laundry in that tannic lake. It was so brown, even in my cook pot, getting water to boil, it looked like tea in there. And that's from all of the needles and leaves on the ground and the groundwater running through those. It's basically leaching them out and making a tea of all of those leaves. It's not so tannic as to do you harm, but it's not as delicious as it could be. As is so typical in Labrador, I was like, oh great, a sunny morning. It's a great time to do laundry. And then by the time I'm done with my laundry, the clouds are closing in again. And then it totally rained on my laundry, of course. Welcome to the Labrador experience, people. Then you see me heading out to check my trap line. You can see I'm wearing a beautiful green wool jacket out there. Love this jacket. I made this jacket specifically for Frozen. I took wool cloth and washed it over and over until it was really thick, really durable, nearly waterproof. And then I did leaf printing on it to give it that natural camouflage look. It was an awesome jacket and really perfectly suited to my body and my needs out there. Worked out for me well. And then you hear me talking about some of the damage that happened from season 6. The summer when I heard that Frozen was a possibility, I knew that I had some major tooth issues. So I said, I'd better go take care of this right now. Went to the dentist. Oh my goodness. I had 14 cavities and 2 crowns needed. You hear me saying that it's from not enough calories and not enough minerals. That was all true, but it was also from eating so many cranberries out there, which are technically lingonberries, but often get called cranberries. Very similar, very, very acidic. So the combination of those things, plus having acid in my teeth all the time, wore away all of the enamel, which made me very, very prone to tooth decay and 2 of my teeth cracking and needing to be replaced with crowns. So I can never get those functioning teeth back. That enamel is gone. And then I get my first hair, and you can see just the incredible elation on my face and what it is to get what feels like real food. Not that mussels weren't amazing. They really were. I really enjoyed the mussels. I wasn't complaining about them like we see a lot of people complaining about them on here, but still being able to supplement those and have something more nourishing, especially when I was afraid that my mussels were really drying up, that I was harvesting enough that I could tell the difference and there were less and less of them. So that rabbit was huge to me. And then you see me eating that hair and saying, it is so good, I could cry. And I was crying. And then later we see Callie eating her grouse, weeping with joy. Not with sorrow, people, with joy and elation over how amazing it is to get food after going so long without it. The flavors will never be so intense your whole life as that first animal you get after well over a week without any. We hear Callie talking about trust, surrendering to the landscape and just believing that it is going to be able to provide for her. I love this. I consider that surrender and trust are 2 very important survival skills, and we can really see the difference. We saw Greg being so worried that it was going to get worse and worse, that he was going to be cold and wet and hungry and the land wasn't going to provide for him. And then we see Callie, who is really hungry, really uncomfortable. She says she's never been this hungry, but she surrenders to the land and has that trust, and that grouse came through for her. So I really feel that the land sees and appreciates our surrender. That is what every creature out there has. Every creature is surrendering themselves to the place. They don't even see a separation between themselves and the place. And I think it's an important survival strategy that makes a difference in how you do out there. Then we get to see Callie's utter grouse elation. Her face is just lit up. She loves that grouse so much. It is so beautiful. It's just written all over her. Also in this scene, I can absolutely see how much sharper her cheekbones are looking than they were at first launch. I feel like I can see that shift more distinctly on Callie than I can see in the other faces right now. And I think that's just the nature of her build and her ability to put on weight versus having a hard time to put on weight. I feel like there's such a bond between Callie and I in these last 2 episodes, the only 2 people to go swimming at the Atlantic. And on this episode, the 2 people who were weeping with joy over the game they got. Love that. When Callie says, "I've never been this hungry in my life," it definitely gave me pause because she was out for a long time on season 7. But hare in particular have very distinct boom and bust cycles. Tons of hare one year, not very many hare another year. Watching season 6 and season 7, it was very clear to me that season 7 took place in a boom year, especially Joe. I think Joe broke an alone record for bringing in the most hares. Maybe it was my location, but I did not have very many in my area on season 6. So I can see where the people who were on season 7 are pretty shocked by how hungry they are. And we hear that a lot. How am I going to be out here without food? Amos, he didn't go that hungry on season 7 because he was getting so many fish in his gill net. Callie was getting a lot of game in her snares. My experience on season 6 was going very, very hungry. So having mussels, having something reliable that was coming in regularly, even if it was dwindling, was a very different experience. So I was hungry, but it wasn't a new thing for me to be incredibly hungry out there. Really, really cool full circle to see Amos finding that ptarmigan that had gotten away from him in the first episode in which we see him. So he finally sees it. And it's been pretty pecked at. It's clear that that was birds pecking away at it because the carcass was still there. Had it been another kind of predator, a weasel or a fox or a bear, that carcass would have been gone and completely munched down. So this is where I'm like, does he have a bear in his area? Because a weeks old carcass sitting around stinking, man, that would call bears from a long distance. So the fact that it's still there, I don't know. And then we see him get another grouse or ptarmigan, not sure. They're fairly similar. Ptarmigan tend to have really feathery feet and grouse have bare feet. Another cool thing that we see in this episode is Amos using his charcoal to catch a spark. So to get tinder, then you're trying to get a spark to land on that and burst into flame. When you're using charcoal, then your sparks are landing on that and they're just igniting an ember, not a flame in your charcoal. But you can blow on the ember and it can grow and grow. And now you have a good sized coal eventually that's going to light up some larger, chunkier, or even potentially damp tinder way, way easier. So it's a great technique that he's demonstrating using charcoal to catch a spark instead of directly into a flammable tinder. Both work. Both have positives and negatives. So I want to talk a little bit about both bird biology and hare versus rabbit biology. So we see Callie butchering her grouse and she's talking a lot about the crop, and then we see she's opening it up. There are 2 different organs in birds, the crop and the gizzard. We often hear a lot about the crop and we don't hear about gizzards as much, except if you're buying chickens or turkeys that have them tucked inside. When you're butchering, it's really easy to miss the crop entirely, whereas the gizzard is this big, very clear organ, but they're 2 very different things with different functions. And so what we're seeing her talk about there is actually the gizzard and not the crop. The crop is essentially like a storage stomach for birds. It's a first stomach, and it is not for digesting the food. It is just for storing the food. So it's basically an outpooching of their esophagus. So they eat their food and then it gets stored in the crop. The gizzard is a completely different organ that other creatures don't have. It's because birds don't have teeth. They just have beaks. So they can't grind down their food. So the gizzard is basically an internal teeth mouth. It's a very strong muscular organ with a very, very strong lining, and they swallow rocks. And then this muscle is so strong that it pushes their food into the rocks. So they empty from the crop into the gizzard. The gizzard works those rocks and chews their food for them, and then it goes into their actual stomach, where now those particles are small enough that digestion can take place. Often, if you don't know about the crop, or if the crop is empty, which is common, then you're never going to see it because it just looks like their esophagus. The gizzard, being so muscular, is delicious. There's real food value in the gizzard because of those thick, strong muscles. It can be very tough, so it's good to cook it for a long time, but it's definitely a good food source. Versus the crop, it's really just kind of a skin sack, not a lot of food value. So now let's talk about hares versus rabbits. I know I use them interchangeably. I usually say rabbits on the Alone show, but there is a difference. It's confusing because a lot of times the words are switched, like a jackrabbit is not a rabbit, it's a hare. In general, hares are larger than rabbits, and they have longer ears, like think jackrabbit. Snowshoe hare, also longer ears. They have longer ears, they're larger overall, and they also have longer hind legs. They're much more adapted for those huge bounds. So when we see tracks that are like, 6 to 10 feet between them, that's hare that have that special mechanism for those big bounds. Another difference in their biology is how they socialize. So hares tend to be a lot more solitary, whereas rabbits are very social and tend to live in underground burrows with a lot of other rabbits. Hares mostly don't nest in the same way. They will go underground for low temperatures or for protection, but they don't have this huge social system that's based on burrow living, communal burrow living. Also, hare young are born what we would call precocial, which means mature from birth, as opposed to rabbit young, which are born what we would call altricial, which means naked and totally vulnerable. So young hares are born with fur, born with open eyes, and with the ability to scatter if a predator comes by. A nest of young rabbits, mostly hairless and with their eyes closed, really are very, very vulnerable and just would get eaten by a predator. So that's one of the reasons why we see more hares in really extreme environments like Labrador and the Arctic, northern Canada, that kind of thing. Really loved seeing everybody get game of some kind on this episode and seeing everyone just loving and appreciating their food so much. Everyone's clearly challenged, but everyone is still definitely in it. Everyone's eating and everybody is persevering. So super looking forward to the next episode of Alone Frozen. Thanks, you guys.